learned audience here does me a lot of honor by coming today to listen to my presentation on the partition, where, of course, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, I have discovered, is a very central figure. And so that's what we are going to talk about. I'm glad you mentioned that in the Punjab book, one of the interviews which I did was with the culprit who led the attack on the Sikh temple about 200 meters away from where I was born and grew up. It's called the Chemi Badshai. And the confession made by this man, Mujahid Tajdeen, tells us how this whole conspiracy was hatched, and the SHO of the Lahore Muzang police station, he brought the local gundas, taught them how to attack and so on. And so on the 13th of August, I think, this attack took place, and the Sikhs who were inside had come actually from all the northern parts of West Pakistan and Punjab and so on. And they were waiting there for an opportunity to cross the border into India, because already the Punjab was on fire, the partition had been declared, and so it was like the Hobbesian state of nature, everybody attacking everybody else in order to survive themselves. So I'm so glad his mother confirmed this story, because one of the things which some of the detractors of that research was that how can we trust oral histories? Maybe he sat at home and imagined all these things. But when his mother confirmed that the same man, I think many of you, they shut up, those people also knew Yaqub Bangash. So my initiation into the partition begins at my childhood. A day earlier, this is the 13th of August, on the 12th of August, my mother, we lived on Temple Road, Lahore, which is one of the central roads in the Lahore built by the British. And at about 10 in the morning, she just happened to look from the window on the road what was going on. Lahore was burning at that time. And she noticed that the local roughnecks, were collected on the right side of where she stood in the window, and some trouble was on the way, because the worst type of characters were there, and Lahore was burning at that time. So from her left, first came a Sikh gentleman, big, strong, on a motorbike. And when he came close to where these guys were standing, they tried to attack him. So he pulled out a gun and fired in the air, and they all dispersed. So he could pass safely. Then, about 20 minutes later, a woman's instinct that there is going to be something terrible going to happen here. She kept on looking from the window down into the road. A Sikh carpenter came on a bike with his daily food attached to the handle. It's called potli in Punjabi. The poor man had no idea that there is a partition taking place and people will be forced out of their homes, they'll have to flee for their lives. So when he approached these characters, they pounced upon him and killed him mercilessly. My mother died in February 1990, and I remember that all along in these years, she would have a trauma, and she would say that this incident which she has seen was debasement of humanity. She just couldn't overcome that an old man, and that also a very poor old man who maybe all his life had served them, in some small, he was a carpenter, and still He was killed without any mercy. So I grew up hating the partition and wanting to know what has happened. And then in my formative years, I read Manto, Krishan Chandar, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Balwant Singh, you name anyone, and uh, Ishfaq Ahmed, later on a right-wing writer, Ahmad Nadeem Qasmi, even Qudratullah Shahab, once again a very right-wing man. Their best works in fiction are on the partition, because partition was a tragedy which made people register their horror at how human beings had treated other human beings simply because they had a very different religion. So, my interest in understanding the partition begins from there. Then, when I looked around what sort of material was available, uh, those in the UK were just writing reports of the governors of Punjab. They were fortnightly reports, uh, or of the chief secretaries posted in the Punjab, what they had been saying. So that was a useful source of understanding how the British were registering the events. But the tragedy was, or the problem was, that all this ended on the 14th of August. On the 15th, power was transferred to the Indian and Pakistani administrations on both sides. And what they have recorded, if they have recorded, is still classified. So we don't know what reports are available. In 1997, there were Indian feminists, Ritu Menon, Kamala Bhasin, and Urvashi Batalia. They wrote on the partition, and they went to some women, Hindu Sikh women, who had been devastated by the partition. But according to Orthodox Hinduism and Sikhism, women who had been in the custody of Muslims were unclean. So many of them ended up as spinsters, living in these houses outside Delhi. So they talked to them and told their horrific stories from Rawalpindi, where one of the worst massacres of the partition took place. So there were these two sources, and then the fictional literature on Punjab. And then I was then at Stockholm University, and the ethnic conflict, the ethnic cleansing, the genocides took place in front of our eyes in Yugoslavia, which broke down. So many of these influences on me kept on urging me. There is a short story by Krishan Chandar, Kalu Bhangi, and I think it's a classic. If someone were to ask me which is one of the greatest short stories written in the Urdu language, I would say this is one. And Krishan Chandar says that there was this man who used to work in the hospital where his father was a doctor, and his duties were to clean all that was unclean there. And everybody abused him and mistreated him. But he says that every time his eyes met with this man, he seemed to tell him, "Why don't you tell my story? I have a story to tell." But Krishan Chandar says that, what was the story? That everybody abused him. He didn't have a mother, he didn't have a wife, he didn't have children. He was simply an object to be insulted all the time. What is the story? How can I write a story about this? And then one day, he says, I noticed that he was taking the cows and the buffaloes. People at that time used to keep these things at home, and even the goats and so on, out for grazing. He was leading them, and Krishan Chandra says, I followed this man. And then I saw that when they were out in the field, he was lying down, and one of the cows was with her tongue, you know, touching his body. And you know, among Hindus, the cow is holy. So the story is that a man who is a Dalit, who is despised for whatever his wrong birth is loved by a goddess of the Hindus.